welcome to Jiggers' Place. I'm Kevin Bemel, your host, and we're here every other Thursday at 5 p.m. Pacific time to have a cocktail and talk about all those things that make life worth living: books, ideas, relationships, everything but the kind of business and professional matters we deal with on each of the other Way to Wow shows. So today, or this afternoon, I promoted the show as I'm going to reveal to you the most Jewish TV show of all time. Now, some of you may be speculating what that show is. Don't worry about that. You'll see if your answers are right. But in honor of this, I did some cocktail research, and I came up with something called a Jerusalem Sour. So if you can see this, there you go. You can see what it looks like, or what it's supposed to look like anyway. So, excuse me, the Jerusalem Sour is kind of a riff on a New York Sour, which is kind of a riff on a whiskey sour. And like the traditional whiskey sour, it's made with rye whiskey. So in point of fact, a lot of whiskey cocktails were actually made with rye whiskey, as opposed to other things like bourbon or, Scotch whiskey, those kind of things. And I think the reason is because when you distill rye, it gives you kind of a spiciness, not hot spiciness like, cinnamon and clove and those kinds of flavors. So for the Jerusalem Sour, I'm going to be using Old Overholt straight rye whiskey. This is one of the classic rye whiskeys. It's one of the first rye whiskeys I ever had. And it's been distilled here in the United States for over 200 years. So it's really a great one. And then in addition to that, I'm going to be using some lemon juice. I always like to use fresh squeezed. You can buy, already squeezed lemon juice. It's perfectly fine, but I was at the store earlier today, got some fresh lemons and squeezed them up, and I like that. And then the other ingredient is simple syrup. So this happens to be Master of Mixes simple syrup. I used to make my own, frankly. All simple syrup is basically sugar that's been dissolved in heated up water is really what it comes down to. And this is made with pure cane sugar, which, is the best tasting sugar. We're going to have just a little bit of this. And then we're gonna float on it an Israeli wine. The recipe calls for a wine like a Bordeaux. So the wine I'm using is Petit Castel. This is a 2018 vintage from Haute Judea, and it's a mix of Merlot 55%. Cabernet Sauvignon 30%, and 15% Petit Merlot. And this one happens to be unrefined and unfiltered. This is, for those of you who know kosher wine, this is not mavushal. So this is probably about, as similar to a Bordeaux wine as you're going to find. And I was at the kosher food and wine event. This is, I think, several years ago now. I actually got to pour the Domaine de Castel wines, and they are fantastic. Okay, so we're going to mix this up. We're going to start with 1.5 ounces of rye whiskey. There we go. Whoop. Okay, well, a little bit more than 1.5 ounces. That's oops, putting it in the wrong vessel. We're going to make it in a shaker. All right, that's okay. It's not going to change it that much. So Ounce and a half of rye whiskey, and then 3/4 of an ounce. Let me make sure I see the right thing here. Okay, there it is. Yeah, 3/4 of an ounce of lemon juice. Yep, that's about right. Yum. And then a half an ounce of simple syrup. Okay. Put that in. And then we're going to fill this with ice. If you were to find the same recipe I had, it says fill it 3/4 with ice. I mean, you know, you don't necessarily have to be so precise, but you do want to put enough in there that it'll really chill it down. Okay, got our ice. Back in here. And here's the top. Okay, and the thing about a shaker or any mixing of a cocktail is you really want to mix it down for a while. So you can see if you look at the recipe, it says we'll shake it for at least 15 seconds. Really, the idea is you're mixing the ingredients, but you're also diluting them. So water oftentimes opens up flavors, especially in whiskey. That's why people drink, whiskey and soda or whiskey with a little water in it. Sometimes you'll see people, if they really want to take a taste of the whiskey, they'll use an eyedropper like this and just put a drop or two. Sometimes just a drop or two is enough to open up the whiskey. And other times, when I have whiskey, I usually have a whiskey and soda at a ratio of about 1 part whiskey to 2 or 3 parts soda. It's just enjoyable and just way to relax at the end of the day. Okay, so there we go. You see how the cocktail shaker? See, it's all frozen all the way around. So that's a good sign that it's been mixed well. Okay, and oops, take that off. Just take the cap off, and we're going to strain this into a cocktail glass. I know a lot of people call this a martini glass, but it's really a cocktail glass. Okay, and the last thing we're going to do is we are going to float a little bit, about a half an ounce of this wonderful red wine. And the way you do that is you take a bar spoon, you hold it right over the cocktail itself, and then you just let it pour on top. There you go. And voila, as we say. Oops, there you go. Okay, and that is, I'll put this pretty tall. Now you can see the layers, right? This is a Jerusalem sour. Take a sip here. And that is good. All right, I'll be with you in just a moment. So here we are, relaxing. We're not at the end of the week, of course, because it's just Thursday afternoon, but soon it will be tomorrow, and what a nice thing that'll be. So you're probably wondering, what is what is this all about? The most Jewish TV show of all times. And it's a conclusion that I drew, not simply, but just after a lot of thought, really. So before I tell you what I think the show is, I want to talk a little, what makes a show, a particular culture, whether it's a Jewish show, whether it's, I don't know, a black show, a Chinese show, right? What makes it so? So I was thinking about this, and I think in some cases, um, we tend to associate shows with a particular group if that group is somewhat stereotyped or caricatured in the particular show at hand. So if you think about, oh gosh, so the Charlie Chan movies, right? For those of you who are familiar, Charlie Chan was a Chinese man who lived in Hawaii, fictional, of course. He was a very astute detective. Now, if you read the books are really attempting to break through this idea that Chinese people in America can only run laundries and restaurants and this kind of thing. That was a pretty common way of thinking back in the 20s, when Biggers, I can't think of his first name, but the fellow who wrote the book, the author's name was Biggers, when he was writing the Charlie Chan books. And the idea that a Chinese man in America would be the foremost detective was really a stereotype busting idea then. But when the movies were brought to, when the stories were brought to the movies, Charlie Chan, well, first of all, he wasn't in the first several iterations. He wasn't even portrayed by a Chinese man. He was portrayed by a white man who was put in makeup to make him look Chinese, and they really sort of exaggerated the sort of stereotypical behaviors of Chinese, the honorable one and worthless one and all that sort of stuff that again we see as a sort of a caricature of how Chinese people behaved here in the United States 100 years ago. So I wouldn't, like, if you were asking me, well, what's the most Chinese movie you've ever seen, I would not make it the Charlie Chan movies, because while they at least ostensibly star a Chinese character, the way he's portrayed is not particularly authentic, I think, to the Chinese experience. So I think that's one aspect that we tend to look at. Another is, do they have aspects of the culture? So, is it something like about, in the case of, I'll stick with the Chinese thing. In the case Chinese food, are they? Does it take place in Chinatown, right? So some people, I think, would argue, well, that makes it a Chinese movie. So then, if a movie, features, I don't know, kugel and matzo ball soup, or just a deli in general, that would presumably make it a Jewish movie, because those are considered to be sort of aspects of Jewish culture. I have to have another sip of this drink. So good. All right. Another aspect, I think, is the people who are in it, or who created it. They are Jewish, and because of that, everything has a kind of underlying Jewishness to it. Now, I think that gets closer to something that might be considered a truly Jewish show, or movie for that matter. So if you look at, for example, The Big Bang Theory, one of my favorite TV shows, one of the characters, Howard, is Jewish. He's overtly so. And in the beginning of the show, he lives with his mother, which, it's meant to be somewhat tongue in cheek, like, the Jewish boy can't let go of his mom, and the mom who can't let go of her Jewish boy, and she treats him like a prince, and that whole sort of gestalt about Jews and stuff. And in fairness, it's very, very funny. And the other characters oftentimes skewer him for his sort of overtly Jewish things that he does, even though from a traditional observance standpoint, of course, the character is not traditionally observant, but he's very culturally Jewish, right? And so it's funny. I'm not suggesting, by the way, that The Big Bang Theory is a Jewish show, but one could certainly make the argument that there's a sense of Jewishness to the show because of the character Howard. On the other hand, they do the same thing with the character of Raj, who is originally from India. I was relating to a friend of mine earlier today what a scene from one of the shows where Raj's parents are doing a Zoom call with their daughter who's in the United States. And I mean, the parents are just the actor and actress who play the parents, and they're just hilarious. And it's now we're here in the 21st century when that show was made, and so now that I think about it, I'm not sure if the actor who plays Raj is Indian, but the actor and actress who play his parents, they look Indian. They may not be. They could be Persian or something like that. They're not sort of white people dressed up or made up to look Indian. So I think that's getting to it. But again, I mean, what they do in that show is they somewhat lampoon the stereotypes, while at the same time, the characters sort of play those off one another. So I think that's another way of looking at it. So what I would argue, though, is a show that is truly reflective of a group is getting down to how that group approaches life, and in particular, if it's a comedy, how they approach humor. And so when I was thinking about this show that I was considering as the most Jewish show, that's where I eventually came down. Now, by the way, it's not in the plot of the show that the way Jews look at life is evident. In fact, I've watched every episode of this show multiple times. I'm not sure that they ever mention anything Jewish in it. There is nothing overt or in many ways even covert in the show that's Jewish. And because of that, and because of the time in which the show was produced, it really was reflective of how Jews lived during that time. So I'm gonna give you some TV shows that you might have been guessing. Oh, well, he's got to be thinking of this show, and this has to be the most Jewish show. So you might have thought, for example, that the marvelous Mrs. Maisel was the most Jewish show because it's set in the 1950s, when Jews in this country were sort of broadly coming into their own post World War II, and the lead character is a Jewish housewife who decides to become a comedian. And again, I think it has some of the cultural stuff and all of that, but I don't consider that to be the ultimate Jewish show. So another show was a show from the 80s called The Goldbergs, which I'm pretty sure was a TV adaptation of what was originally a radio show. So just the name, the Goldbergs, like the Goldbergs, I give out to the Goldbergs, you know. I mean, it says it all there. And again, to a certain extent, the Goldbergs was playing on how a lot of people sort of looked at Jews, some of the stereotypes, and by the way, some of the stereotypes, they have, at least some basis. In fact, I mean, if you go in a Jewish deli, people are talking loud. They just are, right? Whereas if you go into a restaurant that's all sort of, Anglo-Saxon Protestants, everybody's speaking quietly. Those are just, cultural differences between the two. Another show you might have thought of is Larry David's great show Curb Your Enthusiasm. Now, I was fortunate enough to see see and hear Larry David speak at the one of the what is it called? Oh gosh, there's a Jewish institute over as you go over from Los Angeles and San Fernando Valley, the Skirball. There you go. At the Skirball, he was at that time he was still involved doing another show. But Larry David I mean, he's like the sort of quintessential image of a kvetching Jewish guy, and the show was very much, in Larry David's own image. So, it's a contender, but it's not the show that I picked. Next is The Nanny, right? Fran Drescher's show. Now, this was, I think, the most well-known thing that Fran Drescher ever did, right? She's playing this Jewish girl who's a nanny in this very sort of straight-laced, waspy house, right? And it's a culture clash, right? Look, lots of shows like that. Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, very funny as, one set of cultural behaviors and values sort of, clashes with another. But and the thing about those shows and the thing about The Nanny is they're very sort of overtly Jewish in that sense, but I don't think we're really learning anything about sort of how Jewish people navigate the world and something about the sort of inner soul of Jewish people. So this is the show, I assume, if for those of you who are thinking, oh, it's got to be this show, this is probably thought of as the most Jewish show that's ever been on television. It is, of course, a brilliantly funny show. By the way, it's not my pick. So my pick did not show up. I will tell you candidly, I got on Chat GPT and I said, what are the most Jewish shows that have ever been on TV? And they gave me a list, and some of them are like, I've never even heard of this show before, right? But the number one show on the list was, are you able to guess it? Seinfeld, right? Again, brilliantly funny. Jerry Seinfeld, and the whole team they have there. I'm going up on the people's names, but the actors who played Elaine and Kramer and George. I mean, and all the supporting characters, George Parents, the guy who used to play Jay Peterman. Elaine's on again, off again. Even though many of the characters were not Jewish, somehow the whole show was kind of infused with a Jewishness about them. The sign of kind of kvetching nature of the characters, especially George, but just the way they talked, the way they interacted, all that kind of stuff. And also the idea that like when Jerry would deal with his uncle, was it Uncle Louie? I forget the character name. Uncle Louie was like so over the top Jewish, and it was a little bit embarrassing for Jerry. And if you remember the episode where Jerry goes to see his dentist, and his dentist has converted to Judaism, and Jerry is convinced that he converted for the jokes, right? So he can tell Jewish jokes, right? So look, again, the show is brilliantly funny, and it would be my runner-up for the most Jewish show on television, but it's not the winner. Even though I think it starts to get at the heart of who Jews are and how they behave, but it doesn't quite get there. Another sip. So here we go. Drum roll, please, right? What is the most Jewish show? It is Hogan's Heroes, the most Jewish show that has ever appeared on television. Now you're saying, what? Hogan's Heroes? Dun, 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 right? Bob Crane, right, plays Colonel Robert Hogan, and Richard Dawson plays, shoot, I can't think of the Englishman character's name, right? So why do I consider this show so Jewish? So here's what I think, and I didn't, by the way, I always have loved that show. It is one of my, I can watch it over and over and over again. Have since I was a kid. I was old enough that I saw, I think, the last season or two of it in its original release, because I think the last season or two, I think, was like 67, 68. So at that point, I was old enough, my parents would let me watch it. Why do I think it's so Jewish? I didn't know this at the time. It's only recently that I realized the most hilarious part of that show is all the main German and Nazi characters are played by Jewish actors. So Werner Klemperer, who plays Colonel Klink, was Jewish. And by the way, I never got to meet him, unfortunately. He lived out his life in Santa Monica, California, not too far from where I live. And he was a very, very charitable man. I know someone who knew him quite well because he was a big donor to her organization. And she said he was the dearest, most wonderful man you would ever want to meet. Now, you wouldn't necessarily know that by the character he played on Hogan's Heroes, that he was such a sweet, sweet guy. But it's hilarious that the commandant of the prison camp is being played by a Jew. Okay, but not just him. Believe it or not, John Banner, who plays Sergeant Schultz, right? I know nothing, I see nothing, I hear nothing. John Banner is also Jewish, right? So the sort, Sergeant Schultz may be the best character in the show, because on the one hand, he just wants everybody to get along. He's just this sort of big teddy bear of a guy, right? But on the other hand, sometimes he has to be like a real German, almost come Nazi sort of guy, right? Because he is the guard in a prison camp. On the other hand, he really doesn't want to get any of the prisoners in trouble. He doesn't want to get in trouble himself, right? He's so brilliantly funny in the show. And the other thing is, I don't think most people think that Jews are like that big, right? Because he's a big, big guy, but he's also Jewish. Who else is Jewish? Leon Askin. And he's Leon Askin, who plays General Burkhalter, right? So the general, who is a personal favorite of Herr Hitler, right, is being played by a Jewish actor.
Okay. Now, here's a real surprise one. Lebeau, right? The French prisoner of war. He was not only Jewish, he was a concentration camp survivor in World War II, right? And then the sort of pièce de résistance, and I've got to find oh shoot, I meant to look up his name. Hold on one second. One second. I got to get the actor's name. I meant to look it up, and bad me. I didn't do it. Hold on one more second. Bear with me. I'm going to have another sip of the drink. The internet is not being my friend. Uh-oh. Okay, here we go. Okay, yeah. Howard Kane. Howard Kane, who plays the Gestapo Major Hochstetter, was Jewish. So the guy playing the ultimate Nazi in the show was being played by a Jew. Now, why do I think this is so Jewish? And the reason is because this is Jews in America at this time felt strongly they needed to fit in with the larger culture. If you think about the 50s and 60s, it was a very conformist time. Now, we talk about the 60s and all of the revolution that happened in the 60s. That was not most of the 60s. That was already the late 60s on into 68, 69. But for most of the 60s, the attitudes from the 1950s prevailed, and it was a very conformist time. And in general, Jews wanted to fit in, so they didn't want to necessarily be identified as being Jewish. And so the fact of the matter is you have all these Jewish actors in this show, and yet there's no way of knowing that they're Jewish unless you happen to look them up or you happen to know. That's number one. Number two, if you look at all of those characters, Colonel Klink, Sergeant Schultz, General Burkhalter, and Major Hochstetter, all the German characters, right? All of them, in one way or another, are caricatures, not of Jews, but of Jews' enemies, the Nazis, the Germans in power at that time in Germany. And it's such a lampoon, and that is really the essence. If you talk about the essence of Jewishness, it's actually not the frontal assault that we see so often today. It's the coming around and getting them, and they don't even realize they're being gotten in a way, right? Because I don't imagine the vast majority of people, especially former Nazis or people in Germany who saw that show, had any idea that the actors who were playing these ridiculously bumbling Germans were Jewish. Now, I don't know this for a fact, but I'd be willing to bet that the creators of the show knew. And certainly I would be absolutely willing to bet that Werner Klemperer, John Banner, Leon Askin, Howard Kane, all were purposely lampooning their former enemies. Now you say, well, what about the LeBeau character? So if you look at LeBeau, what does he do? First of all, he cooks. That's so quintessentially Jewish, although he does it in a French mode, right? And of the characters, he's the one that's the most sort of Yiddish mama, right? So he's taking an essential stereotype of Jewishness and turning it on its head, because the man is the Yiddish mama. And again, that is an expression of Jewish humor that I think it's hard to understand unless you've been somewhat immersed in Jewish culture. So I can't encourage you enough. Go and watch a few episodes of Hogan's Heroes. It's one of the few shows, I think, that it actually got better as the show was on longer. The earlier seasons of the show, while they're funny, they're, especially the first season, it's much more almost slapstickish, not quite, but it's the humor is much broader. As the show went on, it really sort of matured. It was like, you know, making a stew. It cooked better, and all the ingredients came together. It is brilliantly funny. And the funniest part is the inside joke that makes it the most Jewish TV show of all time. That the actors playing the German roles and lampooning their former enemies were all Jewish. So there you have it. This is Kevin Bemel, your host from Jiggers' Place. And I want to wish you a wonderful rest of the week, an absolutely restorative weekend, and looking forward to seeing you on Monday at 10 a.m. for the next Way to Wow show, Trust and Estates Weekly. Thanks so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed a nice Jerusalem sour. If you liked it, but you weren't quite able to follow along, I will post the recipe in the show notes. Try one out. It was absolutely delicious. I wouldn't, believe me, if the cocktail wasn't good, I would tell you. So thanks again for joining me, and looking forward to seeing you again soon. Signing off as I always do. Marie, darling, you are my belle. Courage